welcome everyone. We've got a very exciting event today. I just want to start before we really get the proceedings underway by acknowledging that I'm dialing in here from the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people in Perth, and they remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their lands. I know many of you are physically sitting at the wonderful Melbourne Law School, and so I'd also just like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and that the Wurundjeri people remain spiritual and cultural custodians of their lands and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs, and knowledge. Just invite those dialing in to reflect on the traditional owners of the lands from the place that they're dialing in from as well. So it's a very exciting day today. We're launching, I'm just going to hold it up, Matthew Harding's book, Charities, hold it so you can see it, Charities and Politics, A Principled Approach. Looking around the world, I think most people would agree there's no better time than the present to aim for that lofty ambition because we're not doing very well at achieving it when you look at what's going on in the world at the moment. We've got a wonderful panel to help talk about this book as well. And I might introduce the panelists, say a few brief words about the book, and then open up for the panel questions. So in terms of panelists, we've got Darryn Jensen, who's dialing in as well. And Darryn has held academic positions in the law schools at University of Queensland, University of South Pacific, and the Australian National University. And since returning to Brisbane in 2022, he's been an honorary senior lecturer at the ANU and continued to teach succession law on a part-time basis. And he also contributes to teaching of property law at the University of Queensland. His research interests have been in the areas of trust, equitable remedies, and the law affecting religious institutions. He's omitted from his bio that he's got a very keen interest in this boundary between politics and charity as well, which is one of the reasons why he's on the panel today. We also have Murray Baird. Murray, as many of you know, has been involved in the charity sector for many years as legal advisor, regulator, teacher, and volunteer. He led the not-for-profit group at Moores Legal for many years and now consults with Prolegis in Melbourne and Sydney, and he was the inaugural Assistant Commissioner General Counsel at the Australian Charities Not-for-Profits Commission. He's been an adjunct professor at University of Western Australia and a senior fellow at Melbourne University teaching charity law, and has served on the boards of various charities. And then finally, we have Matthew Harding. Matthew is one of the world's leading academic experts on the theoretical underpinnings of private law and the law of charities and other not-for-profit organisations, and his published work reflects that. He's also about to embark on some professional life changes. He commences the bar reader course shortly with a view to joining the Melbourne bar, so exciting times ahead for Matthew. I'll be chairing. My name's Ian Murray. I'm the chair of the Charity Law Association, and I'm a professor here at the University of Western Australia in the law school with a research interest, and sometimes teaching. I'm permitted to teach in the area of charity and non-profit law. So we've got about 50 minutes or so to talk about the book that Matthew published recently. So I'll just hold it closer to me. Hold it up so you can see it. Hopefully Matthew has got a few physical copies in the room that he can autograph for people afterwards. But really what this book deals with is the boundary between charities and politics. And as you know, we live in a time of very blurred boundaries, whether that be between the charity and the for-profit sector with the rise of social enterprises, and clearly with the government and political sectors when we start thinking about the extent of services that charities provide and then a range of feedback that's required in terms of advocacy to impact the way that those sorts of services are actually being provided. And even in terms of organisations like GoFundMe, we've got a bit of overlap between the charity sector and the private sphere. And then we also have this sort of interesting question about where we draw the line between political parties, which are for public purposes, and charities, which are also for public purposes. And that's what Matthew's book goes to and tries to really give us some reasons why we might maintain a boundary and how we might go about drawing that boundary in the sand. The nice thing about the book is it's aimed at a broad range of readers, not just the 20-odd people who are charity law nerds, but a much broader range of people, which is excellent. So, Matthew, you probably going to get greater readership from this book than most other charity law pieces that have been written in the past decade, I would say. And you're also quite positive in this book. So it's not just about boundary setting, but it's also about thinking about the benefits that come from setting that boundary in a principled way. And I think you set that out neatly at the outset to the book, that your hope was to promote a politics of the common good characterized by trust, as opposed to the dismal politics built on self-interest and fear. And as I said at the start, you only have to look around the world today to see the latter of those two methods in practice. So if we could have a politics built around common good characterized by trust, that would really be a wonderful thing to come from this book. So I'll stop talking, and what I might do is hand over to one of my fellow panelists to ask some questions, or start asking a question. So Darryn, I might hand to you to kick off with the first question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you also to Matthew for a sort of rich and complex argument that he's presented in this book. My first question, Matthew, is this. At around about page 66 in the book, you commence making an argument that a finding of public benefit might be withheld from what you've called intemperate advocacy, on the basis that there might be an objection to such advocacy from a liberal democratic standpoint. Have you thought about how such an argument, how that theoretical argument that you've made might translate into a concrete legislative measure or a legislative formula? Now, what form would the exclusion of intemperate advocacy take? And is there a risk that such a measure, to the extent that the scope of the exclusion isn't clear, would have a similar chilling effect, the same sort of chilling effect that you were concerned about earlier in the book when you were talking about the vagaries of of purposes which are incidental to charitable purposes?
Thanks, Darryn. Great to see you. And Ian, thanks for the warm introduction, and thanks to CLAANZ for putting this on. It's nice to see so many wonderful people here, and to sort of guess at who the wonderful people are online. So Darryn, your question goes to one of the arguments that I try to make towards the end of the book. And perhaps it's worth taking a step back from that argument to contextualise it a bit so that people who haven't read the book can get a sense of where it sits. So the argument that I run towards the end of the book relates to organisations that have purposes to engage in advocacy in what I call intemperate ways. And what I'm thinking of there are organisations whose purposes are to engage in rowdy protest, media stunts, unreasoned sorts of contributions to public debate, contributions to public debate on, say, ethical questions that are not evidence-based, but rather trying to force change through inflaming people's passions. That's the sort of purpose that I have in mind. And my thinking here has been influenced by a very interesting judgment that was handed down recently, and the judgment was in the Family First case in the Supreme Court of New Zealand. Justice Williams wrote a separate judgment in that appeal. And in it, he is clearly concerned with cases of intemperate political advocacy. He goes to an interesting place. He talks about charity law's structural commitment to promoting altruism in public life. And from that place, he makes a very interesting move. He says, where an organisation is not interested in reasoned debate, where an organisation is not interested in the cut and thrust of free exchange of views on matters about which reasonable people disagree, where an organisation rather is simply trying to force everybody to sign up to its view about some issue, then there's a sense in which that organisation is not altruistic. It's a self-regarding organisation. And I think there's something quite important in this. So in the book, I suggest that if we are going to draw boundaries around political advocacy that we consider to be of public benefit, which is in the end the question that we're presented with in charity law, then one way in which those boundaries might be drawn is by drawing a distinction between the self-regarding advocacy of organisations that are engaging in this kind of intemperate advocacy and the more altruistic advocacy of organisations that are genuinely interested in debate, reason, evidence. Okay, so that's what the argument's trying to drive at. Now, your question is, well, if we're going to do that, how do we actually then address it within charity law? For me, this is to be addressed in the same way as the question of public benefit must always be addressed, in the light of argument, in the light of evidence, and it's a question that needs to be worked out from case to case with a close eye to the facts, and it can't really be dealt with ex ante by legislating a rule. So that would be my first response there, to say we can't reasonably hope for a legislative rule that can help us with drawing the distinction we need to draw. We have the public benefit test. It really is a matter of decision makers taking up the test and applying it with an eye to the facts from one case to the next. Yes, that's difficult. Yes, that generates uncertainty, and that none of that is to be welcomed, but that's part of the territory in applying a public benefit test at all times, and so I don't think it presents decision makers with anything unusual. Lastly, the chilling effect. Of course, we know from past experience that wherever the law has operated a distinction between charity and politics, in light of which some organisations are on the wrong side of the line, there is a chilling effect. We know that it comes with the territory. That may be the case were the public benefit jurisprudence to develop along the lines I'd like to see, that is along the lines that Justice Williams is alluding to in Family First. If there were such a chilling effect, it would have to be monitored carefully. We wouldn't want organisations self-censoring in circumstances where their activities were of public benefit, where their advocacy was of public benefit. But again, I wouldn't see the chilling effect there as any more pronounced, any more concerning than it is in any case where there is a distinction drawn between charitable purposes and non-charitable purposes. Thanks, Darren.
Thank you, Matthew.
Murray, I think you had a follow-up question that you wanted to ask related to this.
Yes, I'll start with the question of bad manners. But firstly, I should thank you for this very accessible monograph, which is full of pithy aphorisms, really. I like the sentence, charities matter. Or charities participate in politics because they perceive that such participation to be the most effective way of doing good for the communities they serve. Or another one, government itself often calls for charity participation in law and policy reform processes, which may prove ironic in some circumstances. But I'll pick up the bad manners question. Executive order re-evaluating and realigning United States foreign aid. The United States foreign aid industry and bureaucracy are not aligned with American interests. They're in many cases antithetical to American values. it is the policy of the United States that no further United States foreign assistance shall be dispersed in a manner that is not fully aligned with the foreign policy of the President. In Australia, the boundary of the preferment category of charity is lawful purpose and consistency with public policy, not government policy. So to return to that intemperance advocacy question, is there a boundary of bad manners or even unlawful activity in Australia, or is any means permissible to achieve a charitable purpose?
So I think this depends on where the law is grounded. So, I mean, as you've said, the law as we currently find it draws the line where we're looking at unlawful purposes or where we're looking at purposes that offend public policy, which is not to be understood. We know that there are further boundaries drawn in the Charities Act, and then with reference to the AidWatch decision that ensure that advocacy purposes have to relate to extant heads of charities. So there are obviously boundaries currently being drawn. What I'm arguing for in the book is a different drawing of those boundaries with reference to a different set of underlying principles. And the principles that I'm drawing on, I think, emerge from reflection on liberal democratic values and their implications for political culture, particularly in light of our constitutional system of government in Australia. And all of this was what the High Court was concerned with in AidWatch. So for me, it is necessary to ask the question, where the advocacy is being undertaken in a way that offends liberal democratic values, or even where it's being undertaken in a way that isn't conducive to a public culture that is built around and reflects those values, then the public benefit question, I think, is open. That's not to say it needs to be concluded against the organisation in question, but the manner and the expressive dimension of the advocacy is not irrelevant. That's the view I'm taking in the book. That's what I'm arguing for. And the reason for that is that when we're thinking about what needs to be present within a political culture in order for liberal democracy to flourish, there does need to be some bedrock of basic respect that citizens have for each other in matters on which they reasonably disagree. There does have to be some basic degree of trust that citizens have in each other and in the institutions that bind them together as a political community. Where those basic cultural factors are absent, then pathologies arise within a liberal democracy. And arguably, this is exactly what we're looking at right now. So all of that, to my mind, is relevant to the question of public benefit when it comes to assessing purposes of engaging in political advocacy.
Could I just start with an example? For example, a director of a prominent advocacy charity wears a T-shirt with a message offensive to the government at a public event. Would that attract the attention of charity regulators, or would you see that as crossing the line in terms of manners?
One could never imagine such a thing happening, Murray, but well, I think the answer to that question probably takes us further upstream, because we're only talking here about circumstances in which the constituent purposes of an organisation entail carrying out political advocacy that is intemperate. And of course, here we've got the distinction between constituent purposes and activities that are carried out in the day-to-day operations of a charity, which is a fundamental distinction and one that has to be worked out before any of the doctrine or the principles that I talk about in the book can even be brought into view. So if you have a charity that is formed for purposes to do with, say, relief of poverty, and in the furtherance of those purposes, members of that charity engage in gimmicky stunts to get media attention, then we may have nothing to say about that from the standpoint of charity law, because we're only really interested in the purposes. The stunts may be considered problematic for other reasons, but the charity regulator may not necessarily.
But are they not means and manners, which seems to be coming into our language as one of the determinants of charity status?
Yeah. So this is a New Zealand formulation that you're referring to. The Supreme Court of New Zealand and Greenpeace talks in terms of needing to assess the ends, the means and the manner of the advocacy in order to work out whether it's of public benefit or not. Now that formulation doesn't apply in Australian law. Nonetheless, a formulation like that is not that far removed from the sorts of considerations that I think should be on the table in my book. Well, I think it's all potentially of relevance, but again, I think the important point here is that we're asking these questions about ends, means and manner with an eye to working out whether or not constituent purposes are of public benefit. And that presupposes that we have identified what the constituent purposes are. If the constituent purposes are something like relief of poverty or advancement of education, then things done day to day in the operations of the organisation are not necessarily going to be of interest to us at all. It's only if the question's still on the table, what are the constituent purposes? What are the data points from which we can draw the inferences about those constituent purposes? If that question's on the table, then it seems to me that it is relevant that an organisation, in light of its stated objects, say in its constitution, is day in, day out engaging in advocacy that has a certain profile and a certain look and feel about it. That might rise to the level of supporting an inference that the purpose is actually not what is written in the Constitution, it's something a little different. Yeah.
Darryn.
I'm going to throw to Darryn because we've got on to purposes, and Darryn, I know you had a couple of questions on purpose characterisation as well.
Yes, well, just to follow on from Murray's question, what I was certainly hearing from Matthew when he answered my question, and likewise when he answered Murray's question, was that, see, I think both Murray and I were trying to search for what is the exclusionary rule here? You know, what is the rule that excludes certain entities from charitable status? And what I was hearing from Matthew is that it's very much a rule about, you know, entities are excluded on the basis of their constituent purposes rather than what they might do from time to time, incidentally in carrying out those purposes. Am I understanding you correctly, Matthew?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So anyway, I had another question about what we mean when we talk about a charitable purpose. It seems to me that those of us who, or at least a sort of common theme among those of us who are sort of skeptical about the inclusion of political advocacy within the realm of charitable, we do so on the basis that, the ultimate aim of an organisation that's carrying out political advocacy is to enlist the power of government to implement their solution to the problem, right? We want government to adopt a whole of society solution to this particular problem, and we believe this is the best solution. Now, of course, there might be many other entities and many other people who believe that a different solution or a different sort of measure is the appropriate way to deal with the problem. I think what comes through to me when I read the dissenting judgment of Justice Hayden in the AidWatch case seems to be taking that position. That the problem with AidWatch was not so much the stridency of their advocacy, it's that they were advocating that government take these measures, and that necessarily excluded. So that was controversial because there might be other people who want government to take different measures or just want government to leave things as they are. So I think the question that I'm sort of edging towards here is that when we say that the purpose is advocacy, right, rather than the ultimate purpose of sort of changing government policy or, securing a change to government policy or securing a change to the law. Now, why do we pitch it at that level and say, in this instance, the purpose is advocacy, and our assessment that that is publicly beneficial on account of its process benefits, the term that you use throughout the book, is because it's advocacy. And accordingly, we're not having to judge whether the actual adoption of the measure would be beneficial or not. So why do we pitch the purpose there? Whereas with an entity that's carrying out, say, the relief of poverty directly, we would say the purpose is the relief of poverty.
Yep. So this is, I think, a really important question and a really important topic, and one that I think needs to be worked through before the arguments in this book can be made sense of, if you like. Because we are in charity law concerned ultimately with constituent purposes, and we know that there is an exercise required in characterising constituent purposes before any jurisprudence to do with public benefit can be brought into view. And we also know that because that characterisation of purposes stage of the inquiry requires the application of interpretive skill, reasonable minds are going to disagree about how to characterise purposes. And you see that in the cases. So you've identified it in AidWatch, I agree. The majority in AidWatch, I think, characterised the purpose as the promotion of public debate relating to the delivery of foreign aid. Justice Hayden characterised it as something different. Query also whether there might have been an argument to characterise AidWatch's constituent purpose as the relief of poverty, in which case there would have been nothing to see in the AidWatch case. Go to Greenpeace in New Zealand and you see something similar playing out. You had the courts early in the piece working with constituent purposes of promoting peace and disarmament. Then Greenpeace changed its objects during the litigation, and the focus then was on nuclear disarmament, the elimination of weapons of mass destruction. So those purposes were being characterised there not as advocacy per se, but rather as political objects or political aspirations that were being pursued through advocacy. Then, of course, at the end of that epic saga that was the Greenpeace litigation, Justice Mallon in the High Court of Justice in New Zealand said, oh, well, no, actually the constituent purposes here are about protecting and promoting the natural environment, uncontroversially of public benefit. So I agree with you, first, that the question of characterising constituent purposes is critical. It is anterior to anything that I'm saying in this book. I also agree with you that it is a very difficult question and reasonable minds disagree and have disagreed even in leading cases. The only other thing that I would say is that, well, I'd say two further things. One is that I think we can probably do better in Australian law to develop some doctrinal tools that decision makers can apply when they are working out constituent purposes. I know we have word investments. I'm not sure that that takes us as far as we need to go in order to have the full toolkit. Ian Murray's written a lot on this and he may want to speak to it as well. And then the last thing I would say is that it may turn out that the arguments of the book apply only in a very, very small number of cases where it is not appropriate to characterise constituent purposes as relief of poverty or advancement of education or so on, where the characterisation has to be these are purposes of agitating for law reform, policy change, reversal of government decisions and so on. Family First appears to have been such a case. But even there, we know that there was disagreement on the characterisation of the purposes. And in the New Zealand Court of Appeal, the majority of that court thought that Family First had the constituent purpose of advancing education. So there is no avoiding the question, but it is a difficult one, and it's not one that we can expect clarity on from case to case, I fear.
Matthew, is the Charities Act 2013 interpretation of Aid Watch as requiring another charitable purpose at the end, limiting that process question? Has it effectively narrowed what the High Court was saying about agitation on policy matters in itself would be charitable? And therefore, does the common law now diverge from the statutory law in this regard?
That's really interesting. So there is obviously a boundary being drawn there in the statute. My memory of Aid Watch is that the majority left open the question whether its reasoning would apply to purposes of promoting debate on matters that did not pertain to the extant head of charity, and so that remains open as a matter of common law. I'm not aware of judicial decisions at the state level since Aid Watch that have developed that thinking any further. The statute certainly draws that boundary. I think there's a good argument that the boundary being drawn there does not emerge naturally from a sound understanding of the reasoning in Aid Watch. The reasoning in Aid Watch seems to recognise the process benefits irrespective of the content of the advocacy, at least irrespective of whether the content of the advocacy pertains to an extant head of charity. And so, you know, if the judge-made law at the state level were to develop along the lines you've suggested, that wouldn't surprise me, and I think it would be in keeping with Aid Watch. But then the question arises, where do you find the boundaries in that process? This is where I think liberal democratic values come into play and allow for some order to be maintained over the recognition of advocacy type purposes as charitable.
Or as you commented in other contexts, the gravitational pull of the statute may well determine the way the common law moves.
Indeed. And that's a whole topic for another day, because there's a huge amount of interest, to me at least, in the interaction of the federal statute and state law as it's being developed in the courts, to the extent that it's even being developed in the courts. For example, relationship between Section 6 of the statute with its prescriptions around how to apply the public benefit test and what is said in AidWatch about the public benefit associated with political advocacy or stimulating public debate. That relationship between the statute and that judge-made law is not clear to me. Not clear at all. Yeah.
And Matthew, just thinking, you might want to elaborate a little bit on a point that I think comes out of that discussion with Murray, which is really around when you see a bunch of advocacy activities as amounting to a separate purpose. I think sort of part of what Murray might have been getting at is, when is that bunch of advocacy activities sufficiently connected with the stated object in your constitution that it falls within that? So you're looking at a relief of poverty or advancement of education purpose. And where do you draw the line and say, well, hang on a second, we've now got a separate purpose here, this bunch of advocacy activities. Yes, sure, it might have some causal connection with the stated object, but there needs to be something, or perhaps there needs to be something a bit more. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that? I know we're sort of pushing you a little beyond your book because you keep saying,
that's fine.
Well, you've got to determine your purposes and then you apply what I'm saying. But there's somehow both things are interconnected.
It's a really difficult question. So I know if Sue Barker were here, and she may be online, I can't see. She is. Sue might say, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Sue, but you might say, well, the surest guide to ascertaining constituent purposes are the expressed objects as to be found in the constituting instrument for the organisation. And that's where you look, and that's where you undertake your exercise in characterising purposes. And once you've done that, then the question of what those purposes are and how to apply the public benefit test to them is clear. At that point, if there are activities, if there's stuff going on day to day in the operation of the organisation that seems to be at odds with what's expressed in the constituent instrument or the constituting instrument, then that's not a matter for, that's not an existential question when it comes to purposes. That's rather a matter of governance, and we might at that point want to ask questions about whether there's mission drift or breach of governance duties and so forth. So that's about, if you take that approach, then it gives you a relatively high degree of clarity about how to find constituent purposes, but it does narrow your view to only a certain data set, which is to be found in that constituting instrument. And we know from our travels in the Australian law that that's not how it's done here. And of course, Sue and I have talked a lot about the situation in New Zealand, which was now confirmed again in Family First, which is that it's not done there either. In their case, because their statute expressly provides that at the point of working out whether an organisation is to be recognised as a charity, activities must be taken into account. And in our jurisprudence, thanks to word investments and cases in which it is recognised that inferences might be drawn from activities. But I'm not sure it's possible to be more... once we accept that inferences can be drawn from activities and the course of operations of an organisation to clarify what the constituent purposes are, I'm not sure that we can get more clarity from one case to the next. The same sorts of interpretive issues, it seems to me, come up in cases where you have organisations that espouse a public benefit mission, but at the same time have members and provide benefits to members. And of course, the various Chamber of Commerce cases and the case of the Law Institute of Victoria are good examples. You read those cases and you can see the question of characterisation of purpose is absolutely critical to the determination of the case. You can see that there's a whole range of evidence that comes into play, much of it to do with what's going on day to day in that organisation. But I don't know, maybe it's just me, but if you read those cases and think that there's any kind of clear set of principles being applied, then I'd like to know what they are. But I'm not sure when you reflect on what's being asked of the decision makers in cases like that, I'm not sure what more they can do once inferences from activities are available to them as a matter of principle. What else can they do? The alternative, it seems to me, is to take up a suggestion like Sue's, but that would require a departure from the current law. I can see Jennifer Petruni has her hand up.
I was just thinking it's probably a good time to open up to the floor for questions. Can I just check in with Darryn and Murray whether they had any follow-up questions for Matthew before we do that?
I'm happy to open the floor at this stage.
I wouldn't mind, you pretend Equality Australia, and what we found then is an affirmation of this sufficiency of connection test. What would that do to your book?
If we were to apply it?
Yeah, now that the law has been opened up to us, our eyes are open to sufficiency of connection, does that have implications for advocacy?
Can I jump in there? I think we have to remember with Equality Australia that they were held not to be a PBI, but they were a charity. So there is not necessarily a sufficiency of connection with advocacy and charity.
Yes.
So I mean, I'd be interested in your comments on that, because Equality Australia was, clearly it wasn't argued, it was just taken for granted that Equality Australia was a charity. But it was a pure advocacy organisation. And the sufficiency of connection that Murray's just raised was in connection with PBI, which is a very different animal to a charity.
Yes, so the key question in that case is, benevolence. Are we looking at benevolence here? And my understanding is that, sorry, yes, we should probably give Jennifer the mic. So I can see how it would be necessary in asking the question whether this institution is benevolent to know the extent to which its day-to-day operations are in line with benevolent objects. Because the key question for charity law is not about the character of an institution, it's about the character of constituting purposes. It's not so clear that you require that sufficiency of connection, right? And we know that. We've seen that recognised not just in the political advocacy setting, but we see it also in cases where charitable organisations are running businesses on a commercial basis, and we've seen it where charitable organisations are engaging in all sorts of activities that on their face look remote from constituting objects as expressed in a trust deed or a constitution or what have you. We've seen that time and again recognised as okay, so long as we're not looking at a course of operations that begins to suggest that an inference should be drawn that the purpose is not what it looks to be on the face of it. So I do think there's probably a difference between those two types of case, in that the inquiry in the PBI case is a more encompassing inquiry, which is looking to whether an institution is benevolent, whereas in the charity case, we've got a much more clear focus on purpose.
Now, Murray, there are a couple of online questions, but I might delegate to you just to chair for in the room, because I suspect there are probably a few people in the room with their hands up.
No hands apparent at this stage, so we'll go online. I think you do online, and I'll tell you if there are hands up.
So, question from Bridget Cowling about Aid Watch and where the boundary of that might develop. And so, Bridget's saying, if Matthew's book largely relates to what is in the public interest beyond the boundary of Aid Watch and how we construe that. Then can we infer that the advocacy subtype in the Charities Act should carry the presumption of public benefit? It currently does not.
So this is, thank you, Bridget. So this was what I had in mind earlier when I was saying that the relationship of the reasoning in Aid Watch and Section 6 of the Charities Act is not clear to me. If we think about the reasoning in Aid Watch, what are we looking at there? We're looking at reasoning that goes a bit like this. We have a constitutional system of government that is committed to representative and responsible government. In order for that to operate effectively, a certain kind of political culture must pertain in Australia. That political culture needs to be one in which there is a freedom on the part of citizens to express political views on matters that pertain to the system of government. And then extrapolating from that, all of which is constitutional law and developed in the implied freedom cases, from that, we can take the further step to say that as a matter of charity law, there is public benefit in making a contribution to that culture. That, to my mind, is ultimately what is being reasoned in the majority decision in Aid Watch. So that, to my mind, goes well beyond findings about Aid Watch itself, right? There's a sort of quasi-constitutional argument being put there and connected up to questions of public benefit in the law of charity. Now, in Section 6 of the Charities Act, my memory is that the decision maker who's got to answer the public benefit question is directed to take into account benefits and detriments, direct and indirect. You know, there has to be the full fact-based inquiry. And yet in Aid Watch, we have a High Court ruling that says that where you're looking at political advocacy on the part of charities, it is of public benefit because of the contribution it makes to a political culture on which the Constitution depends. So does that then affect the way in which decision makers must apply Section 6? I don't know. There are people in this room who have been decision makers applying Section 6, and I'd be interested in what they think on this. But I think that that is one among a number of issues arising out of the Aid Watch reasoning that remains unresolved. Which brings us back to the point Murray raised earlier about the interaction of the statute and the judge-made law here. That's been on the table as a key question since the enactment of the Charities Act, and there's been very, very little interpretation of the Act by the judiciary that would enable us to get closer to answers to those questions.
Shall I ask another online question, Murray?
Online, yep.
So Sue Barker thanks you for raising her argument, Matthew, and expands on that.
I hope I got it right, Sue.
But then also raises the point, which I think read Section 18.3 of the New Zealand Charities Act as well. This is the section which says that the New Zealand decision maker can have regard to activities in registering an organisation as a charity or not. I think Sue's point is basically that the court interpreted that section incredibly broadly, perhaps beyond what's permissible in interpreting a bit of legislation, in reading in the extent to which activities can be looked at. I don't know, I know that we've moved outside of Australia to New Zealand. Do you want to comment at all on whether that's a broad reading, whether we're likely to see change in that space?
I agree with you, Sue. I think it is a broad reading because my memory of Family First is that the majority there are saying, plurality there are saying that Section 18, subsection 3 requires the decision maker to look to objects, activities and proposed activities. So I suppose you couldn't get a broader range of inquiry than that. And I think in Family First that drove the decision maker to all sorts of places, including Family First's website, and all sorts of inferences appear to have been drawn there about what Family First was doing and was proposing to do. And you can feel all of that when you read the judgments as the case goes through the courts, that there was a sense in which the field of inquiry that was thought to be open to the regulator under Section 18.3 was perhaps not within any reasonable bounds. So I guess this just underscores my point. I don't have an answer to any of these questions about purpose characterisation, but I think the point is one worth making again and again. It seems to me so much turns on this question of purpose characterisation, and that is precisely the question on which we have very little stable, settled jurisprudence, interpretive practice, beyond very grand statements such as the ones that come from the High Court in Word Investments. And in fact, Word Investments is a good case to think about here, because when you think about how the purpose characterisation process was played out in Word Investments itself, there's a whole list of things in the objects in Word Investments constitution, and some of them were declared to be purposes and some of them were declared to be powers. On what basis were the ones declared to be powers found to be powers? Beyond simply an all things considered intuitive sense of what made those objects and that clause of the Constitution work. But again, maybe we can do no better than that. Maybe that is just what we have to work with if we're in the business of purpose characterisation, and if that requires there to be recourse to stated objects and activities and operations over time, maybe we can't do better than where we're at.
Thanks, Matthew. Murray, there are still more online questions, but I want to check with you, have we got questions in the room?
No, stay online. They're absorbing it here. Not contributing.
All right. Well, Matthew will be happy because we've now got a question that moves away from purpose.
Jennifer's back.
Waving furiously, so we'll go to Jennifer.
I was contemplating with Family First the struggle the court had with the boundaries between propaganda, education and advocacy. And the court, particularly Justice Joe Williams, grilling me on what is the difference between education and propaganda, and how difficult it was to find a satisfactory answer to that. Is it that education, you educate both views? Well, you're never going to get an anti-abortion person teaching abortionist views, and vice versa. They're diametrically opposed. And so does that mean an abortion advocacy is always propaganda? I'd be interested in your views. I might have missed this right at the beginning, but I think it's a very interesting dilemma.
That's a really interesting question. I don't discuss it in the book, but it is a hugely important question when we're thinking about political advocacy purposes that are close to the line. And yes, in Family First, the court clearly struggled with that. It can't be that advancement of education includes only purposes that involve instruction in a sort of detached, even-handed way. That can't be right, because there are academic disciplines in which that is not the case, and they are well recognised as academic disciplines. Moral and political philosophy would be an obvious case in point. This book is seeking to persuade you about something. It is not simply seeking to instruct you about what is out there as a matter of human knowledge. So that can't be where the distinction lies. But of course, once you decide that that's not where the distinction lies, where on earth do you draw it? And I think that Justice Williams clearly had trouble with that. And my memory of the case is that ultimately he and the others decided that, well, we don't need to know where the boundary is because Family First is so far over the boundary that it doesn't matter to this case. So there again, you know, you are faced with the need to work through very difficult questions about value on which reasonable minds disagree in order to answer the question, in this case, in order to answer the purpose characterisation question. And this, for me, is one area in which I think that the argument I'm putting in the book might get us to a better place, because if we were to develop the law of charity along the lines that I'm describing in the book, we wouldn't have to worry so much about the distinction between the advancement of education and political advocacy. The question would be one of public benefit. And the answer to that question could be delivered irrespective of which so-called head of charity the purpose fell under. So that we're now sort of at the, you know, we're at the front door of another very complex set of questions to do with why we maintain heads of charity and the benefit that we get within the legal system, maintaining heads of charity and all the effort that goes with that, rather than simply administer a public benefit test across the board. But of course, we know we maintain heads of charity because some of them attract presumptions, but we don't. But then on the other hand, we know that these presumptions often don't really apply as presumptions. And in any event, we've sort of, why are the presumptions there in the case of some heads and not others? All of that's for another day. But I think that something like a development, something like what I'm describing in the book, would alleviate some of the pressures that the court felt in Family First on that front.
Thanks, Matthew. I think we've probably got time for one more question. Are there more in the room, Murray, or should I ask an online one?
Ask an online one. Yeah.
All right. So Caitlin Edwards is asking about the relevance of public law principles to your exclusionary rule, Matthew. This is probably music to your ears because you're now getting back to your core argument. And I know in your book you talk about looking to liberal values to help set out the exclusionary rule. So I guess Caitlin's saying, what about public law principles? What sort of sits some of the values that sit underneath those principles help you in formulating that exclusionary rule? She's referred to implied freedom of political communication cases, but I guess there could be others as well. So just your views on that.
Well, hi, Caitlin. Thanks for the question. Yes, indeed, AidWatch shows us what's possible in that regard. And we shouldn't be surprised that we would be looking to the conceptual and normative toolkit of public law in trying to fill out our understanding of the public benefit test in charity law, because that test is one that's directed to the production of public benefit. And we see that coming up not just in these cases and certainly in AidWatch, but also in other cases where the question of public benefit has proven difficult. So I'm thinking now of cases where charitable trusts or organisations have constitutive purposes that on their face discriminate against people on grounds of race or sex or religion and so forth. In those cases, we've seen courts reaching for the public law toolkit through a public policy doctrine in order to work out what to do in response to those trusts or organisations. So, Caitlin, yes, I think public law does offer some very interesting resources here.
Thank you, Matthew. Well, given the time, we probably should draw proceedings to a close. So I'd just like to, again, thank you, Matthew, very much for producing this book and agreeing to this event. It's been a great opportunity for CLAANZ to actually delve into the very difficult questions. Matthew's been very kind. It was easy for us to formulate questions, much harder to answer any of the questions. So thank you, Matthew, for writing the book and answering all the questions. And thank you, everyone, for coming along to this book launch as well. And just keeping in mind that there is another Charity Law Association workshop next week looking at proposed changes to accounting standards for charities, which you should have received the details for as well. So please join me in thanking Matthew and then also Darryn and Murray, who very kindly and with no arm twisting required at all, agreed to sit on this panel and talk about Matthew's book. So big thanks to Matthew, Darryn and Murray.
Thank you. Thanks, guys, for being here, and to the panelists especially. Murray told me he's read the book 3 times. And that already puts Murray in the camp of the person who's read my work most.
You're on a Scotty or Stations train from Blackburn. You get a full reading even. You used an economy of words. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.